Hey guys, it's Mr. Messner again, our next installment of our Gilded Age uh, Progressive Era Reconstruction Unit. So this is lecture number 3 of maybe a 5 or 6 part series. We'll see where that goes. So we've talked about the gildage, what it means to gild things. So things are looking good from the outside. Our industry is really driving our economy, our culture and society, and raising the standard of living for many people in America and changing fundamentally. Are we a farming country? No, we're going to be an urban country, living in the city, near the city, working factories, driving new technologies and generating wealth as well. We also talked in the second lecture about Reconstruction and just this problem that we had with slavery. Now slaves are free and liberated. People of color have more rights as guaranteed by the Constitution, but it's not still going to be the case where people of color in America are still going to be treated as second-class citizens. We won't find really rectification of that until the 1950s and 60s through law. And there's the argument to make that there's still this implicit bias. There's still segregation, de facto segregation that's going to happen throughout American society. We'll get there in the civil rights movement when we get to the 1950s, 1960s, but it's important to talk about sort of the things that happen in this time period of Reconstruction, specifically in the South and also to the North. And so we're continuing, though, kind of where we left off in what's going on in the country. So tremendous economic output and then some of the issues in society. We're going to talk more about those issues in sort of the widespread sort of view of what's going on in this time period from the 1880s until the early 1900s. And so this is where a group called the Progressives really, and muckrakers is another term for these people that want to sort of change all of these bad things in society. But today is specifically going to be a discussion on those bad things in society. What are they? What needs to be changed? What is going to give rise to these groups of people that want to reform things? And so that's going to bring us to our PowerPoint for today. So here's where we ended up after our last lecture. Is the end of Reconstruction. And so today we're talking more about the problems, not necessarily for people of color, but in a wide sort of variety of Americans and American life, large issues specifically that come about because of this Gilded Age, this tremendous transformation in terms of technology and wealth generation and businesses being created and new technological advancements in using raw materials throughout America. So some of the problems that crop up and during this time period, 1880s, 1890s, are these boom and bust cycles that happen in industry. And just like if you watch the stock market, the Dow Jones or NASDAQ, it goes up and goes down. Sometimes when it goes up tremendously, a lot of people make a lot of money, but then there's also the opportunity to have huge crashes, what we call crashes in the economy, and we call those busts. So there's boom cycles where people and businesses are doing well, and then also bust cycles. And that happens pretty frequently in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, because the markets and businesses are pretty heavily under-regulated. They're not being very regulated by government. And so as we get to the 1930s and the Great Depression, we're going to see government sort of encroach more on businesses to make sure that we don't have another Great Depression again. And we'll talk about that when we get there in history too. And then number 2, what we're seeing in this problem is tremendous corruption in terms of scandals and bribes. The government is in charge of all these resources and land use. Who gets the land? What do they get to do with that land? And so as government is dispensing a lot of resources, a lot of land and sort of rights to corporations and businesses to use as they want. So they're going to be sort of fallible in that they are going to accept bribes. Oh yeah, I'll give you this piece of land. Give me some money. Yeah, it's yours now. Do with what you want. One of the famous scandals in this time period is called the Teapot Dome scandal, where the Ministry of Interior, so the man in charge of basically all of the government lands in America, ends up giving this oil company sort of rights to gather oil from this one section of land, and they go and do so and make tons of money. And so what do they give? Well, they gave this Department of Interior secretary a lot of kickback money for letting them use that land, even though it was not supposed to be used. It was not supposed to be oil drilled. It ended up being so. And so the public finds this out, newspapers report on it, and the guy ends up, being disgraced as Secretary of the Interior, but he did make a lot of money. He went to jail for a period of time. And so that's a good example of some of the corruption happening. Politics are going to be corrupting people during this time period because politicians want people's vote, right? They want to be reelected. And so what they're going to do is sort of have what's called a political machine, where they're going to enforce like people below them to work for them. And then below that, those people that work for them are going to go make sure that they're getting enough votes, and they'll intimidate voters or steal voters, or they'll fill out ballots for people to vote for them. And so there's a lot of also corruption in terms of politics and how people are winning elections and how votes are counted. And so specifically in cities, we're going to see that a lot, specifically New York City. We'll see that a lot too in Chicago as well. And so there's a widespread corruption in this time in politics and economics. And so we're going to see some reforms that need to happen, some changes that need to happen in order to make life better here in America. And then number three is there's going to be tremendous waste in terms of life and resources. A great example is the buffalo herds, which natively roamed our country throughout the Midwest, the Great Plains, without obstruction or restriction. And then we get barbed wire setups to keep in ranching herds. And then buffaloes are just wild scaled, killed for why? Well, for sport, almost hunted to extinction until they're saved and sort of housed in Yellowstone National Park to sort of repopulate. And now they've come back, and now, you can even farm buffaloes and have bison burgers and things like that. So, but that in our forests also are going to be just decimated, in which all sort of old growth forests, those forests that have been around for generations, for hundreds of years, are just going to be logged. And so even in Washington State, only 1% of our forest that remains is old growth forest. So 99% of our forests are going to be logged in this time and after. And so all that remains of old growth forest is about 1%. And that's in the toughest areas of kind of our state to get to, obviously, because it'd be tough to get there to log it. But maybe you've been to places like Snoqualmie, and they have the huge cutouts of the tree and how big the trees used to be, or other cities. They're kind of just like monuments now. And then you can go and see how big trees used to be. And we don't ever really see them that big anymore unless you go to one of these old growth forests in our state to go check it out. So, but tremendous sort of waste in terms of our resources. We could even, chalk up our salmon population and overfishing. Not necessarily in this time because there's not many people here settling, but we're going to see these huge like fish wheels just literally dipping into the water and pulling up fish. Did we need that many fish? And are they going to be all saved without wasting? Not necessarily. And as well, it's going to be a tremendous waste of lives. About 35,000 people per year are going to die in accidents, mainly mining accidents, trying to mine resources and minerals, because people are only going to be paid for what they mine out. So do they want to put up sort of logs to protect themselves inside of mines, or mining companies caring about that? No, they're just caring about getting the coal or the gold or the silver out of these mines. And doesn't matter people's lives so much. So there's all these problems that need to be corrected. And let me go on to talk about some more problems. So as cities continue to grow in this time period, so before the Civil War, cities were relatively small and were not major urban centers. Yeah, like a lot of people lived there, but not as we know cities today, which are huge hubs of our country and society. So within cities, most people walk places. You didn't need a car or even a horse and buggy unless you're transporting something. But as we get after the Civil War, we start to see steel being used to erect huge buildings because it's very structurally sound. And so you're now able to build for the first time skyscrapers that are 10 floors high. And that was the first skyscraper. And the name skyscraper is literally, these buildings are so high that they are scraping the sky. Have you thought about the meaning of that word? And so the first skyscraper was 10 floors tall. And now we have buildings that are, hundreds of floors tall. It used to be that the United States had the largest buildings, which was the Empire State Building, which was the largest for a while. And then the Sears Tower became the largest in Chicago. And so now other cities in the world are making the tallest buildings, and we're paling by a lot. So But as buildings and cities are growing and able to house more people, and more people are moving there to work in these factories and have a city lifestyle, this rapid growth is going to lead to government issues, because you're going to have all these people that need services. Maybe they need financial help from the government. Maybe they need food. They have to get their food and eat somewhere. They have to have, police protection from crime. So it's going to lead to all these government issues, as well as mentioning, political machines are going to be controlling these cities. And so, these political bosses or people elected are only going to do what they want to do, make themselves rich during this time, and secure their votes that they are in these positions for their whole life. And so that's going to lead to very poor lives for many people, because those resources aren't trickling down from these political bosses in power down to everyday citizens. And so the life for people in cities was pretty rough, was pretty poor. On top, compiling that as sanitation issues, where are all these people going to go to do their business? And the alleyway was where people were going, unless their buildings happen to have indoor plumbing, which starts to emerge in this time, but wasn't accessible to everyone. What happens if there's a fire? It's going to devastate the whole building complex, or even whole city blocks. Most major American cities in this time period are going to have tremendously devastating fires, including Seattle in 1889 is going to have a fire which wipes out the whole city of Seattle pretty much, and we build right on top of it. If you've ever taken the underground tour of Seattle, pretty cool to see the first city, and then it got burned in 1889 and then built right on top of it. And so that you can still take the underground tour and go see things. So tremendous issues. On top of that is also class divisions. The divide between sort of the rich and poor is what I'm referring to as class divisions. So for the first time, you see the emergence of what is called the middle class, where it's people that aren't born into wealth, that their family's not rich, but because they go and get an education. At this time, a high school education was a big deal. If you went to college, which was very rare, then that would secure you sort of a life of privilege for the rest of your life, because that could ensure that you're an industrialist or an entrepreneur, you're a business owner, and you're creating jobs, and you get wealthy that way. You're a financier, and that you are able to invest in companies and make yourself wealthy that way. You could be a banker, a lawyer, a manager, a doctor, other entrepreneurs. So if you went to college, if you even finished high school, which is weird to think at that time, then that would give you the education to be able to move yourself into the middle class, which for the first time is emerging in American society. It doesn't become really big until really after World War II, in which the middle class explodes. But we're starting at this time for the first time to see you're not just a poor farmer, or you're not just a rich sort of landowner. Now, after the Civil War, we have other people that are working in occupations that are generating them a lot of money and revenue for themselves. And then on the bottom, instead of just farmers, now we're seeing people in the cities that are working in the cities in these factories that are crafters, miners, mechanics, textile workers, unskilled workers working in factories that are now a part of the low class, the working class. And so education was a luxury. Not everyone could just go until high school. It was a big deal just to make it to the 8th grade. That's pretty much nowadays graduating high school. A big deal was making it to the 8th grade. So you're 13, 14, 15, you're finishing the 8th grade. That's a major achievement. But for most people in the working class, the lower class, they would have to leave education either as a child or before they could even finish the 8th grade, because their family needed them to work and help them to generate income so that they could survive. So we see very high birth rates, meaning many families are having lots of kids, because families, we had lots of deaths within families, but also needed children to continue to grow the wealth for that family. So would need children and young people about your age to go and to be working and to provide for the family. But because of sort of the low standard of living, there's also high death rates. There's disease from poor sanitation and things. There's also sort of the dangers of being in these big factories and working there, dangers of just walking in the street, and getting run over. So life was pretty perilous. There's lots of dangers. And so that's why we see high birth and high death rates in this time. And for example, many families are just packing into one room where there's one bed. People are going to be sleeping on the floor. There might be running water. There might not be. So sanitation is pretty poor, and it's becoming a disease factory, spreading disease like the Spanish flu in 1918. It's going to be a major outbreak, a big comparison to Corona and COVID-19 now. And so people are really struggling to survive in these cities, and they don't have gardens. They're not farmers anymore. They left their farms to come to the city, so they're not able to farm and harvest and collect food. So they're dependent on grocers and other people in the cities giving them whatever food is available, and they can't always afford the best food. So even stale and rotten food is better than no food. So hopefully you're getting a sense that there's this tremendous sense of the haves, and we have this middle class, and then the upper class, the rich families, and then a tremendously large, especially as immigrants are joining sort of this working low class that are working these factories, doing great things for business and industries, but at the same time as, just kind of eking out survival as family in this time. We're also going to see the birth and growth of unions at this time. And why were unions developed? Well, we're seeing a rise of machinery, okay, and mechanized sort of labor. Now we don't need many people to perform skilled labors, to make barrels. Now we can have machines do that. And so as people are continuing to move to the cities, we call this urbanization, there's also a larger workforce. So what do unions do? Well, they're a collection of workers that want to protect their jobs and protect their industry from losing their jobs, really, or being treated poorly from their employers. So the goals of unions are to maintain and control wages, to protect their jobs, and to improve working conditions. And so unions, workers would get together and be like, hey, we're not working unless you make things better for us, unless you give us a pay raise, or unless you're not hiring immigrants that can steal my job. And so it's unions that are going to negotiate contracts with businesses. And we still have them today. If you work at Safeway up the street, you are forced to be in a union. If you are a teacher, you are in a union. And now we have the choice whether to be in one or not. And we're strongly encouraged to be in a union because you have power when everyone's a member of a union to negotiate with businesses and to get better things. So the unions, especially in our state, are highly advocating that you are in the unions, but you have a choice whether to be or not. And the first major successful labor union in this time is called the Knights of Labor. Here's their symbol up here. They're not around anymore because they got absorbed by other big unions, but they were the first successful national union. In 1887, there were some 100,000 members, which is pretty awesome considering there's about 70 million Americans at this time. So it's about, I guess it's only like 1% or something of the whole population, but let's see, is that 1%? Yeah, I think it is. I can do the math. But so the Knights are going to be the first labor union to also accept women and minorities into their membership, which was really rare because unions usually did not represent women, minorities, or immigrants or other unskilled workers because they're trying to protect their jobs, usually from women or minorities or immigrants or unskilled workers that they're fearful are going to come in and steal their job and steal their work from them. But we have in this time period the start of unions, which are still around very much to this day, although we're seeing sort of their participation and their power declining basically in the last 40 years. Also sort of Gilded Age politics. Politics at this time is not going to help contribute to anything great. It's going to be control basically, for instance, the House of Reps are going to change back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, then back to Democrats and back to Republicans. And so since like things in the House and in Congress are so chaotic, not a lot of legislation is going to be passed that is going to help American citizens, is going to help our American society and culture. And part of it is just coming out of the Civil War time period as the parties want to keep some sort of peace between the parties. We just fought a civil war pretty much where we had the Republicans in the North that represented the Union and ended up winning, and majorly Democrats in the South that were, that lost, but are still kind of bitter about it. And so we have this very fragile sort of political stage in America where both sides are not trying to anger the other and just kind of wanting to move on with life. And so a lot of things are forgotten. A lot of things that would have benefited Americans are just kind of forgotten to just kind of be like, okay, let's just move forward for, you got some strong feelings about this or that, but we need to move on. And so that's going to initiate, even in presidential elections, the election of 5 presidents that historians declare as kind of the forgotten presidents. starting with Rutherford B. Hayes, who was elected in the Great Compromise of 1877 that ended Reconstruction in the South. He was a Republican. Then his successor, Republican James Garfield, then he gets shot and assassinated. He's another president that dies by an assassin's bullet. And his vice president, Chester Arthur, takes over. And then Grover Cleveland becomes the next Democrat, the first Democrat since the 1850s to get elected president of the United States. So it was a pretty much 50-year lapse because of the Civil War between Democrats being elected because Democrats were the major party kind of in the South, and it was tough to get popular, but they were behind Grover Cleveland able to get reelected again. And so we'll see sort of Democrats continue to get elected president going forward into the future. And then Benjamin Harrison, also Republican, gets elected. So, but historians call these gentlemen forgotten presidents, basically because they got elected in not trying to divide the country, really didn't do anything, didn't have any strong legislation, any strong support, any one way or another to just kind of keep the peace in this Reconstruction time period moving forward. So the public wanted reform after all these presidents and 20 plus years of not doing much in Congress and in the presidency. So there's going to be all of these sort of corruptions that are going to reach a bubbling point, which is going to spur people to political action that we really haven't seen in American history before until our revolution, pretty much. And we call these people the progressives. And I'm going to stop today. I'm not going to talk about these progressives. We'll talk about them and their reforms that they initiate in our next lecture. But I just want to bring us to that point to kind of talk about all of the things. Again, this is the Gilded Age. So from the outside, it looks really good. Like the economy is really driving people, but driving businesses. We are going to become one of the top economies in the world. But if you look closer, the life for an average American is not much better than maybe before the Civil War. Maybe not even that, because people are off their farms, so they're not able to farm things for themselves. Now they're living in the cities and struggling that way too. So, all right, but this is lecture number 3. We'll continue in the series next time.